Hi, and welcome to It's Not Obvious Java Edition. And today I will be talking about basic functions. Okay, so specifically what I'm going to be covering today is I will be talking about components of a function, creating and calling a function, and really briefly about static and non-static methods and recursion, and a brief introduction to this concept of scope. As a prerequisite, I highly recommend that you watch my previous video on variables. And as always, this video is intended primarily for my CSS 142 students, but this is also going to be useful for anyone who is new to creating functions in Java. All right, awesome. So who am I? Again, if it matters, I'm a part-time faculty at the University of Washington, and I am also currently a software manager at Amazon, specifically in AWS Kumo. If you want to know more about me, you know where to find me. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to chat with you more. All right. Before we begin, I want to address the question, is this programming? And the answer is sort of. This is one of the tools that you're going to need to properly engineer a complex program. Specifically, you're going to be using functions to create reusable components. And if we think about the PET model, problem-solving engineering tools and terminology, there's still a lot of terminology and tools that we're going to cover in this episode, and a little bit there in terms of engineering, because that's the whole point of creating functions. All right, so let's get into it. The basic components of a function, you'll also hear me say method. Function and method are actually synonyms, or at least as far as I'm concerned. And I'm going to use the term interchangeably both in my current episode, future episodes, as well as when I'm teaching. So previously, I talked about the main method. And we can also think about a different method that are kind of similar to the main method. Here we have another method that says public static void say goodbye. Previously we would have main, but here we have a completely different method name, function name. Instead of main, we have say goodbye. Now, public is what I call the access modifier. It could be public, it could be private, and we'll talk about private access modifier in the future. There's static, which is more of a qualifier, which kind of indicates what's going on. Is this a static method or is it a non-static method? And void is what's also called the return type. Return type must always be there for a function. Void simply means there's nothing to return, but there's also any variable type or any variable type can be used as a return type. So the name can be anything you want. The parameter list must be there, but the parameter list could be empty. There could be a bunch of parameters. And today I will be demonstrating just a tiny bit of that because this is just the basics, a brief introduction to functions. In the future, I'll go a lot deeper into the types of parameter lists, and which also ties a little bit into overriding and overloading type of stuff. All right. And then you, of course, have the body of the function, where in this case, we just have a print statement that says, thanks for playing, see you again. Now, I also have a link here to the Java tutorial from Oracle in terms of methods. So let me just open that up real quick. And that would be this. If you go to this link, you will see that Java, Oracle, the people who created Java, have a tutorial on defining methods. You can follow this tutorial that says, hey, this is a typical method declaration, modifiers, return type, etc. Very similar to the kind of things that I say. There's also naming the method, although a method name can be any legal identifier. Code conventions restrict method names, etc., etc. Basically says that method name should be a verb in lowercase, multi-word name that begins in a verb lowercase, followed by adjectives, nouns, all sorts of stuff. Now, there's a lot of things here to unpack. And when it's talking about conventions, it basically just means regular things that people define and hope to follow as best practices or something similar to that. For the purposes of what we're doing, I'm going to follow a slightly different convention than is recommended here. Typically, what I recommend is that a method is going to include some sort of a verb. And I would also differentiate a method from a variable by having every single word in the method begin with a capital letter. Anyway, so let's get into it real quick. Let's talk about creating your own function. And again, a function name can be anything you want. There are some restrictions similar to the restrictions to variables, and one of the clear restrictions is that the function name cannot have spaces in it. But at minimum, you must have a return type, the name, the parameter, even if the parameter is empty, and the method body. And for this episode in particular, I'm going to assume that you're beginning every single method with public static void. Okay. Now, in the future, we're going to explore a lot more in terms of different return types, in terms of static versus non-static. I'm going to give you a little bit of preview of that today. So let's go to BlueJ. As always, we start with BlueJ, we create a project, and the project can be anything that you want. Function demo, and remember that the project name can have spaces in it, doesn't really matter. Then you go to create a new class. If you have a space in the class name, function demo, it really doesn't like that. It really needs to be just a single word, no spaces in it. So I'm just going to say example. And as before, if we were to open the code, we would see that there's a whole bunch of stuff that BlueJ has already included. For now, we are still going to delete everything, but I want to point out a couple of things here. This is an example of a method. Public int sample method int y. So public is the access, and int is the return type. But wait, this is missing static. This is missing the keyword static, and instead of void, it has int. Sample method is just a method name, can be anything you want. And here inside the parentheses, we have a parameter. What do all those mean? We'll talk about it briefly, and we'll talk about it in the more specific context of public static void something. So I'm just going to get rid of all of that, get rid of this too, because it's not super relevant to this particular episode. And let's start with public static void main. String array args like we normally do. And we'll do system out println hello world like we normally do. Okay, so then we right click example, compile, we run this, okay, and we see what we typically expect, which is hello world. Now, let's create another method. Public static void display message. Okay, and let's say here system out println some message goes here. Now we can compile this, and it says class compiled, no syntax errors. We can run this, but it still only has hello world. And the question is, what happens to this message? Some message goes here. It's just not there at all. Now, if you want to show this message, some message goes here, you need to do what's called calling the method. And but calling the method basically takes the name of the method and the open close parentheses. If there are parameters, you do need to put something in the open close parentheses, but if not, then you just have the open close parentheses to indicate that you're trying to call a method as opposed to working with a variable. Right, so now we have println hello world, and then we have display message, compile, run, and now we have hello world, some message goes here. All right, so let's explore this a little bit more. What if we put both the system out println for hello world and some message goes here in the same method for display message? So now in the main method, we don't have anything at all. We just have display message. Compile, run, and as you can see, it goes to display message. Then it jumps into line 11, public static void display message. Line 12, the opening of the function. Line 13, which is the first statement, some message goes here, and it prints it out. And then line 14, system out println hello world. And then it comes back over here. How do we know if it comes back over here? Well, let's demonstrate that too. System out println method finished executing. And as you can probably imagine, it prints method finish executing after we run everything instead of display message. Okay, so this is what a function does, which is kind of fascinating, and it's kind of cool because that means that you can call the function as many times as you want. In fact, we can do display message a whole bunch of times. Compile. And in fact, why don't we do this a bunch more times? Compile this and run this. And you can see same message, some message goes here, hello world, some message goes here, hello world. So what's happening is that on line 8, it goes to display message, it goes here, it prints out some message, goes here, it prints out hello world, it comes back to line 9, display message, and repeats the same thing again until everything is done, and then it prints method finish executing. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to methods. So let's talk about it a little bit more. The main purpose of creating a method is, again, to be able to use it by calling it. You call a method by writing a statement that includes the method name and open close parentheses. It jumps to the line of code where the method was called, to the line where the method is defined, into the body of the method, and then it goes back to where it was before it entered the method. You can call a method as many times as you want, and in fact, you can call a method from inside itself. This is called recursion. Let me demonstrate what recursion looks like in a moment. And as a quick note, static methods can only call other static methods for now. Okay, so let's go back to this and let's demonstrate what that all means. Okay, opening all of this. Now, I've already demonstrated to you calling a whole bunch of methods from the main method. What happens if, for example, instead of display message, we call display message again? First of all, this compiles. The computer actually lets you do this. It's kind of weird because you're defining display message by itself. It says, hey, display message, execute this line, and then call display message again, which means it goes back here to line number 12. Okay, well, it compiles. And now let's see what happens if we run this. If we run this, it just repeats display message over and over again until you end up with something like this that basically is an error and it continues to struggle to execute this. So what you need to do when this happens, oh, well, one is to wait for the program to basically crash. Here it has a Stack Overflow error, which I'll explain sometime, but really it has to do with the Stack Overflow website. It kind of ties into that. And looks like it is done executing, and basically it says, hey, there's an error. There's a whole bunch of errors at line number 17, and it says specifically Java language Stack Overflow error. Line 14, line 17, line 14, line 17, and this is where it says this caused a Stack Overflow error. Okay, now you can see here as far as the output though, it basically just repeatedly calls the method over and over again. This is what recursion is. The concept of recursion is a method where it calls itself. For now, you probably do not want to do recursion. You probably want to avoid recursion for now because it's likely to cause a Stack Overflow, basically an endless loop that eats up so much memory that the computer experiences an error. So don't do that. Don't call the method from within itself for now. In the future, I'll talk about recursion and how recursive methods can be very, very useful. But before that, we need to talk about loops first so that you understand the basics on how to avoid exactly something like this, how to avoid an infinite loop, for lack of a better word. Okay, now the other thing that I mentioned was that static method, in this case public static void main, can only call other static methods. So here, if I were to get rid of static and just do public void display message, it doesn't let me compile because it says non-static method display message cannot be referenced from a static context. All that this is saying is that because the main method is static and you have display message, which is not static, this static method, which is main, cannot call this non-static display message. Well, one way to do that, of course, as we know, is to put static back in here for display message. Compiles, we can execute this again, and this works the way we expect it to. Cool. Now, if on the other hand, we get rid of static from display message, compile this, we get the error, and we go, all right, well, why don't we get rid of static from main? Because that means now both main and display message are not static, and it works. Class compiled, no syntax errors. Well, when you come back over here, there's nothing to execute. Remember how normally we right-click on the class and then we execute main? Well, main isn't here anymore, and the reason why main isn't here is because it's not static. In order for it to show up over there, it needs to be static. And that's why we need static on both main and display message. Okay, well, let's explore this a little bit more. Let's explore the concept of scope. And scope really has to do with the idea that a particular programming construct only works within the scope where it's defined. Inside of BlueJ, we look at the colored boxes for scope. And in general, we want to think of a smaller scope can see a broader scope, but not necessarily vice versa. And here I want to demonstrate the experience of scope by working with variables. Right, so let's give that a try. Here, what we typically do, and I'm just going to get rid of all this. What we typically do is we'll have a variable instead of main, and let's say int x equals 10, and then system out println number plus x. And if we compile this, we can run this, and this is what we expect it to be. Number is 10. Okay, great. Now, display message, presumably we can use something similar. System out println number plus x. Except that in this case, if we do that, it's going to say cannot find symbol variable x, and you're going to go, what's going on? Clearly x is over here inside of main. How come the computer is saying that display message cannot find the variable x? What is going on over there? And the main reason is because as far as the computer is concerned, x only exists inside of the main method. So maybe at this point you're thinking, well, Hansel, obviously that's because you haven't called display message just yet. All right, well, let's see. Let's see if we were to call display message. We compile, we still get the same error where we say, hey, display message, we have x over here, and then we jump into display message, and we expect display message to magically know what x is because x, we've already defined it before we call display message. It still says cannot find symbol variable x. Okay, well, the reason for that is because as far as the computer is concerned, x belongs to only main, and only main has access to x. If you want display message to have access to x, you actually need to define x in here by itself. Okay, but now you're thinking, well, how is that possible? Because from the previous episode about variables, we know that we cannot have exactly the same variable name declared multiple times. And here we have a declaration for x inside of main, and we have another declaration for x inside of display message. Will this work? First of all, yes, it compiles. And second, if we were to print this, if we were to run this, we get number is 3 and then number is 10. So first, the computer goes in here, executes main. We go to line 7, x equals to 10. Then we call display message, which jumps down to line 14, 15, 16, and then it creates another x. This x is very specific to display message, and the value is 3. Then to line 18, we print number, and whatever x is, which is 3, which is why it prints that first. And then line 19, we're done with display message. We jump back up to line 9. We say, well, we're done with this. Move down to line 10, move down to line 11, print number, and now we go x, which is the x that is available inside of main. Okay, the same rules that you've learned previously about variables still stand. So let's say if we were to try to do int x equals 12 over here, it's going to say x is already defined. But now notice it says x, variable x, is already defined in method main. You can clearly see that there's a different distinction here between x inside of main and x inside of display message. Same thing, if we were to go to display message and we say int x equals 7, it's going to give us a similar error. Variable x is already defined in method display message. So now you get the sense that you can have multiple variables with the exact same name in different methods because it has what's called a different scope. And you know what the scope is because it's inside of this yellow box. And in fact, we can create additional methods if we want. Public static void do something. And we can have yet another thing over here, int x equals, let's say 18. And then system out println number plus x. And let's say display message calls do something. And what's going to happen now is we can compile this, we can run this, and first it goes into main, line 7, line 9, display message, line 16, line 18, display, number is 3 because x instead of display message is 3. And then we call do something, which jumps down to line 25. X is now 18 in do something. Print number is 18. And then we go back over to do something. We're done. We go back to display message. And then here on line 11, then we execute number is whatever x is instead of the main method, which is 10. Okay, so this is a really brief introduction to methods, and I hope that this is useful. And there's the possibility that this is going to raise more questions. And among other things, one of the questions that you might ask is, do I need to have int x on every single one of this? Short answer is, no, you don't. You can have int y over here, and of course you're going to have to do number as y. You can also have int, let's say num in here, and of course instead of x you do num. Compile, execute, you can run it, and in fact you don't even necessarily have to use integers. You can use, for example, string message equals number plus, let's say 13, and then here instead of printing all of this, we can say message. We can compile this, and we can run this, and we get 13, which is this one, 18, which is instead of do something, and then 10 instead of main. So you can do whatever you want inside of a method. Anything you can do inside of main, you can put inside methods. Now, really quickly, why do we want to create additional methods? Previously, I mentioned that the main method is like the beginning paragraph to an essay or to a story or something like that. Now imagine a 10-page essay where everything is inside of one paragraph. That's not good writing, and that's not, that would be very painful to read through. And that's the same idea to this. If you have everything, every single code you write instead of the main method, then it's kind of like that. You're dumping all of your code in just one method instead of separating it out into logical components that you can reuse and call over and over again depending on what you need it for. And that's why we want to have multiple paragraphs, for lack of a better word, that have very specific purposes, and we can call those paragraphs anytime we want to have it do what we need it to do. And again, keep in mind that the method can be called in anything, and the method can also be called instead of if statements, and in the future instead of loops. And I also demonstrated earlier that you can call methods instead of itself. One last thing before I end this particular episode. You'll notice that do something, open close parentheses. This is a very similar syntax to system out println open close parentheses message. You've been doing this the entire time, and you've been using a method called printline, and this is what you've been sending to the method in order to work with it. Now, what does that mean, and how do we send arguments into parameters for a method? We'll save that for another episode, but for now, that's something that you need to keep in mind. You have been using methods. Now you're moving away from calling methods that other people have created into the realm of creating your own methods, and you decide how that method works. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you so much. And as always, my question to you is, were there anything obvious to you? Did you learn something new from this episode? And if there are things in here that seems obvious to me but were not obvious to you at all, definitely let me know in the comments and I will address it. Okay, and as always, if you like the episode, please subscribe for more content and I'll see you next time. Thank you.